Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Jang-cho. In the new year, South Korean President Moon Jae-in is out to reinvigorate efforts to promote inter-Korean economic cooperation. President Moon said inter-Korean cooperation could expedite denuclearization talks between Washington and Pyongyang. Today we discuss the impact and the limits of Seoul's plans.
남북 관계에 있어서도 할 수 있는 최대한 협력 관계를 넓혀 나간다면 북미 대화를 촉진시킬 뿐만 아니라
still remain hopeful that North Korea will make the right decision.
In the studio with me today, Ambassador James Zumwalt, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. Ambassador Zumwalt was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs and was responsible for policy toward Japan and Korea. Also joining me, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin spent more than 3 decades in the U.S. government and think tanks, specializing in Asia-Pacific security. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Cronin, South Korean President Moon Jae-in is reinvigorating his efforts to boost inter-Korean cooperation, and his ideas include border area cooperation, South Korean citizens' individual tours to North Korea, reopening of Kaesong Industrial Complex. How feasible are these plans?
Well, these are old ideas, and they're trying to get new energy. And so President Moon, from the very beginning of his tenure, has been pushing and leading an inter-Korean peace and rapprochement. There was some success early on with North Korea taking some steps, but they were very modest steps. And what the problem really is that North Korea just has not been forthcoming, has not reciprocated the affection for South Korea that President Moon is trying to show toward North Korea to win a peace.
Mm-hmm. And North Korea is shutting out South Korea.
North Korea is shutting it out, and it's making demands. Kumgang Mountain, for instance, they want destruction by next month of all the buildings there, presumably because that would mean new money might come in, and they're trying to attract more money.
Now, Ambassador, so the State Department said that the United States supports inter-Korean cooperation and coordinates with our RK ally to ensure inter-Korean cooperation proceeds in lockstep with progress on denuclearization. The White House earlier on said that UN member nations should abide by UN Security Council resolutions, sanctions on North Korea. What do you take of these responses from the U.S. government?
I think the main message is that the United States hopes that the Republic of Korea will calibrate its policies carefully, pursue interpeninsular cooperation while at the same time respecting and coordinating with the UN sanctions process.
So you are very accustomed to the diplomatic lingo. So this word that supports inter-Korean cooperation, should we take note of that? Does that mean U.S. is now more open to inter-Korean cooperation than before? Any ideas by South Korea?
I think it's not so much that the U.S. is more or less open toward inter-Korean cooperation. The U.S., though, would like to see inter-Korean cooperation occur when it's the right moment, given North Korean actions. And I think at the present time, we don't see that North Korea has taken steps that really would lead to the right atmosphere for enhancing North-South cooperation at the moment. That said, we hope that there will be that atmosphere in the future, and we will see steps from North Korea that would lead to a better opportunity for South Korea to pursue these activities.
So Dr. Cronin, so Seoul's this renewed push for inter-Korean cooperation, would this raise concerns over a fissure between Washington and Seoul, just like it did in 2018 over the pacing of cooperation and denuclearization?
There are always some anxieties on both sides that will South Korea move too fast to try to make peace with North Korea when North Korea is not reciprocating. But North Korea is the limiting factor here. So even though South Korea will push, North Korea just will not do very much. So South Korea will limit itself. I don't think, therefore, the United States is that concerned about our South Korean ally. We trust South Korea. We just worry about North Korea.
And U.S. Ambassador to South Korea, Harry Harris, said that in reaction to President Moon's comments, said that Seoul should go through the U.S.-South Korea working group over any kind of cooperation with North Korea to avoid misunderstanding that could trigger sanctions on South Korea. And in reaction to that, the Blue House today said that it is very inappropriate for the ambassador to make such a mention in the media over remarks by the president of the host nation. Do you agree? And what do you make of this rising tension between U.S. ambassador and the host nation?
I think what Ambassador Harris was trying to convey is that as close allies and partners, it's very important for the United States and South Korea to coordinate closely on policies. So there's two aspects to that. The United States has an obligation to communicate carefully with South Korea its engagement with North Korea. And at the same time, what we hope to see from our friends in the Republic of Korea is close engagement as they implement policies vis-a-vis the North.
Is it often that there's a tension between an ambassador and the host nation?
I don't know if I would use the word tension. I think Ambassador Harris's job is to convey the views of the United States government, and likewise the Korean ambassador in Washington, his job is to convey carefully the views of the Moon administration. Mm-hmm. So I think the ambassador was doing his job, and what I'm hopeful is that we will continue to have very close coordination between South Korea and the United States.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Cronin, there is a growing personal attack on U.S. ambassador in South Korea, especially over his mustache, because South Koreans think that his mustache looks like Japanese Governor General during the colonial times. And they're also taking issue with the fact that Ambassador Harris is born to a Japanese mother. So after going through the worst spat between Seoul and Tokyo recently, how would this be received in Washington?
Now, as for attacks on Ambassador Harris, all I can say is that this is a great American who cares deeply about America's ties to Korea. He keeps ties to the entire region, and he's served with distinction. So I don't think facial hair undermines a record of achievement and commitment to a Korea-U.S. alliance. I think the Americans would be just a bit befuddled by this and uncertain what's going on here, because we don't see any problem.
And I think Americans don't look at him and see an ethnic background. They look at his achievements in his career and are quite impressed by his tremendous achievements.
Mm-hmm. And in reaction to South Korean President Moon's latest push for inter-Korean cooperation, France said that the current situation does not justify lifting or scaling down of sanctions. This reminds me of October 2018, when President Moon was on a 7-day trip to Europe to gain support for easing sanctions on North Korea. And France back then also opposed to this idea. So do you think President Moon is still going against the majority view of the international community when it comes to easing sanctions on North Korea?
Well, I think the international community still is very wary of North Korea because North Korea has not made meaningful steps on denuclearization. But there is a split, obviously, among the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, with Russia and China having put out an offer on the table. France, as another P5, permanent 5 member, is obviously saying no. United States, UK, we should be careful about what North Korea delivers. Once North Korea shows that it's meaningful, it's willing to go into serious steps of denuclearization, I think there'll be international sort of coordination and push for sanctions relief. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cronin just mentioned about China and Russia, and they recently tabled a resolution to ease sanctions on North Korea. This comment that really I keep on thinking over and over is that this analyst said that because South Korea is an ally, President Moon has the reason to be heard in Washington. So what is your take on that comment?
No, I think it's very important as an ally that South Korea's views be heard in Washington, just as it's important that Washington's views be heard in Seoul. But the key issue, I think, as Patrick mentioned, is it's important for the United States and South Korea to remain closely aligned, because what North Korea is trying to do is to stoke divisions between us. So we have to communicate closely, listen to each other, and then forge a common approach.
Mm-hmm. And the President Moon also said that inter-Korean cooperation would expedite talks between Pyongyang and Washington over denuclearization. This is his long-held view. But what did we see so far? Was this proven effective?
Well, 2018, there was some progress, even if it was limited. Certainly the whole context changed. But in 2019, we saw a record number of missile tests from North Korea, and we've seen heated rhetoric out of Kim Jong-un himself, including talking about suspending the moratoria and holding up some new strategic weapon that we'll see later this year. So, unfortunately, North Korea has moved backwards since 2018. And I think we have to try to figure out whether there's some diplomatic fix that we can at least do a little for little step agreement. And I'm going to the swearing in today on Friday of Deputy Secretary Stephen Biegun, and I think that means that the North Korean issue is going to be elevated even more between Secretary Pompeo and Deputy Secretary Biegun. There is a great interest in seeing if North Korea will now sit down and make some meaningful progress, because the United States, South Korea want to do business, but North Korea is going to have to deliver on its promises.
Recently, advisor to North Korea's Foreign Ministry Kim Kye-kwan said that North Korea is not going to come back to the table unless U.S. accepts all its demands, and that it's going to backtrack from previous offer in Hanoi of trading partial sanctions relief with Yongbyon nuclear facility. What do you make of North Korea's current calculations?
Well, I think they're wrong, but I do think they're consistent. They're consistent in that they want more concessions. They want financial investment. They want money. They want sanctions relief, and they don't want to give us very much for it. So this is about bargaining, and this is the bargaining position we're hearing out of North Korea right now. But ultimately, Kim Jong-un could make a different call, and that's what we're, I think, hoping, that he will say, look, I've listened to it. This is the best you're going to give me. Okay, I'll give you a meaningful step. I'll take a little bit here. I'll give you a little bit.
Recently, Secretary Pompeo met with his counterparts from South Korea and Japan and sought ways to renew momentum in the denuclearization talks. How important was this meeting?
I thought the meetings in California between the three foreign ministers were extremely important. I think they confirmed that South Korea, United States, and Japan share common interests. We want to see peace and stability in the region. We want to see progress in constraining North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. We're also somewhat concerned about China's assertive actions in the region. So the meeting highlighted that we have common interests and that we should be working together to meet our common concerns.
Recently, President Trump and also Secretary Pompeo said that there is much China can do at this point. What can China do?
Well, I think China is limiting North Korea's maneuvering room. That is, North Korea might really want to fire that space launch missile, but it's so far resisted that urge because China would react badly, and they want China to be at least supportive of North Korea vis-a-vis the United States on these negotiations. But beyond that, I wouldn't expect China to be too forward-leaning on going back to greater pressure. And that's indeed what we've seen with the Russian and Chinese proposal about relaxing sanctions. I think the relaxation of sanctions, though, is the carrot on the table for Kim Jong-un if he chooses to eat it.
And Ambassador, you're a career diplomat. So recently, the Treasury sanctioned North Korean companies exporting forced labor abroad. And this is when National Security Advisor O'Brien said that he offered to North Korea to continue talks in Stockholm. So is this the kind of a very common way of approaching diplomacy while, approaching to the country at the same time sanctioning that country?
Yes, I think it's important to recognize that sanctions are a tool. The goal is not to sanction North Korea. The goal is to use sanctions in a way that will induce North Korea to take meaningful steps to denuclearize. So on the table is we will reduce the sanctions or reduce the sanctions in exchange for meaningful steps on the part of North Korea. So what the United States was doing was enhancing its leverage, if you will, but that doesn't mean that we're uninterested. In fact, we remain very interested in meaningful talks leading toward a reduction and elimination of North Korea's nuclear and missile programs.
So the easing of sanctions would only come after North Korea changes its behavior?
I think the easing of sanctions would come as a result of a negotiation between North Korea and the United States where each side would take meaningful steps. So I would certainly encourage the U.S. government as well to think about the step-by-step approach where each side makes some concessions leading toward the ultimate goal of denuclearization of North Korea.
And in this deadlock, do you think the U.S. government is moving more towards that idea of phased approach?
Well, the reason I don't think that's the case, is one, because I think Steve Biegun's always been open to that. But two, I just think they haven't seen from North Korea the willingness to take a significant step. And so the reason not to talk about an action for action with North Korea if you're the United States is you're trying to hold out for North Korea to say, look, I really will take a serious step if you give me something.
And North Korea's advisor Kim Kye-kwan said that the leader's personal relationship is not good enough reason for North Korea to come back to the table. So do you think President Trump, and this is soon after President Trump sent a birthday congratulatory letter to North Korea, so do you think that President Trump's tweets and his letters, are they not effective anymore?
I think it's positive that the two nations' leaders have a relationship where they could call each other or talk to each other, particularly if you get to a crisis state. It's very important to have those high-level communications channels, but those channels alone are insufficient. We also need hard work on the part of both governments and hard work on the part of all of the relevant nations, including South Korea and, as Patrick mentioned, China, in order to come to a solution here.
That's important. The working level talks are important, but what can America do when North Korea is not responding?
I think we have to be patient. We have to sustain the course, which means to implement the sanctions regime, and in the expectation that at some point North Korea will seek to escape from this sanctions regime by offering meaningful concessions.
And how long will the stalemate go? Is North Korea waiting until President Trump gets reelected?
I think so, because North Korea clearly could scuttle the entire diplomacy if it wanted to. All it would have to do is go back to long-range missile tests or a nuclear test, and I think the diplomacy would be broken, at least for a period of time. I think North Korea is interested in negotiating with Donald Trump, but they are maybe waiting to see whether he will be reelected. And if he's not, why would you make a deal with a president who only has a few months in office? So they may be now biding their time, waiting to see what will happen. But they still want sanctions relief as soon as possible. So they might do a small step along the lines of what Russia and China are offering in terms of sanctions, minimal sanctions relief.
Well, we'll have to leave our discussion here and now move on to our next discussion.
우리 국민과 기업의 안전, 호르무즈 해협 인근의 자유항행을 위한 국제적 노력에 우리가 기여하는 방침을 세우고
We will not be participating in American or European initiative, but we will be closely communicating with United States as ally.
Secretary Pompeo met with his counterparts from Japan and South Korea and called for collective efforts to safeguard the Strait of Hormuz. With increased attacks on oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, Washington is asking allies to join a maritime security mission, the International Maritime Security Construct. Now, Ambassador, so Japan decided to send a maritime self-defense force to international waters and not join American or European initiative. The Defense Secretary announced next to American Defense Secretary. And South Korea is also reportedly considering sending its own troops independently. So is this in line with what Washington has been requesting to its allies?
Well, first of all, as major trading nations, South Korea, the United States, and Japan, and nations in Europe, all have an interest in keeping major international trade routes open. The Strait of Hormuz is a choke point that's relatively easy to cut off, and Iran has been attacking civilian oil tankers. So I think it's very important for all of the major trading nations of the world to take actions to deter any country such as Iran from interfering with international trade.
Well, I think we'd be sending a stronger message to Iran if we were doing it in unity. But the second best alternative is that we do it separately. We've done similar things in the South China Sea, for instance, where there's not a joint freedom of navigation operations, but the Japanese will sail through or Korea will be sailing through to Taiwan. And I think that still sends a message, and it still will be helpful. Let's remember that Korea, Japan, China, India, those are the countries receiving all the oil coming out of the Strait of Hormuz.
And after the strike on Soleimani, is it more important now than before for the allies to join in this effort to protect the Strait of Hormuz?
It is, because we have a very tenuous lid on deterrence right now in terms of using lethal force. I know somebody like General Petraeus has said this may have restored deterrence. I wouldn't be so sure that's long-lasting. Iran may well strike out, and they've already shown, as Ambassador Zumwalt said, at tankers in the past. They've threatened the Strait of Hormuz and to close it. So we should all be on our guard to deter that from happening in the first place.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the major difference between Iran and North Korea on how U.S. is approaching the two countries?
Well, Iran threatens our interests in the Middle East, including our ally Israel. In North Korea's case, our ally is leading the inter-Korean peace talks. So there's a fundamental difference in how our allies are looking at the threat. Secondly, we've created a huge vacuum in Iraq and in the Middle East in recent years that Iran has stepped into. And so we are reacting to that. North Korea has been contained over the years. He's trying to build missiles and nuclear weapons, but it can't really use them. So it can't really break off the peninsula the way Iran can break into the region and threaten wider interests.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador Zumwalt, you were part of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy Mission, which recently conducted an annual field study in Northeast Asia. And they found that Japan and South Korea had concerns about America being less predictable, less committed to rules-based system, less engaged in the global order. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, the National Committee on American Foreign Policy had a very productive visit to both Seoul and Tokyo, and also we co-hosted a trilateral dialogue among the three nations. And I think what you mentioned is true, but it's also true that both South Korea and Japan recognize that their alliance relationship with the United States remains very important.
So why do they have these concerns over America?
I think the concerns on both sides, South Korea and Japan, where they don't see the predictability, and so they're at the same time they remain very dependent on their close ties to the United States. So one reaction is to try and build what is called a networked alliance. In other words, to expand ties with other like-minded partners. And this is one reason why I think a good relationship between South Korea and Japan also remains very important, because both nations have more options in dealing with in a more uncertain world if they can improve bilateral ties between them.
So Ambassador Zumwalt's committee just found this wariness of South Korea and Japan over America's unpredictability, according to the study. And Japan and South Korea also went through a big spat recently. So how can the three nations overcome this damaged cause already?
Well, I think all three of us have much more in common than we have in disagreement, and we have to work on those common areas. In real policy and high policy, we ought to be working on things like the Persian Gulf. We have a common interest in keeping the peace. As Ambassador Zumwalt said, this is a major choke point for international commerce. We all depend on commerce, so we must maintain deterrence. And then thirdly, let's look at some other commonality like dealing with the cyberspace, because cyberspace is a growing problem. It's a complex one. We should be setting the standards for peace and cybersecurity, including with countries like North Korea.
Well, we'll have to leave it here and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of trucks in North Korea transporting scrap metal to factories. Scrap metals include old parts and equipment. A slogan here reads, "Let's support the party with steel." Dr. Cronin.
Well, it reminds me of pre-World War II America, where we're literally having to say, let's, we need to absolutely conserve everything. Let's have a paper drive. Let's bring in our tin cans. It's all going to the war effort. It suggests that the economy is hurting to me. This is not just a good recycling program that's going on. I suspect it's really the economic sanctions are biting, and that's really what I think we're waiting to see, whether Kim will make a change of policy as a result of that economic pressure and the diplomatic opening that we're offering.
Ambassador?
I would agree with Patrick's conclusion that this shows the impact of sanctions. What it reminded me of, frankly, was the Cultural Revolution in China, where people were throwing their woks into the fire to make steel in backyard furnaces. It's not a sign of economic strength.
No. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Ambassador Zumwalt, Dr. Cronin, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And to our viewers, thank you for watching and supporting this program. I'm now going on a new assignment, and you're now in good hands with Connie Kim. For Washington Talk, I'm Eunjung Cho.